Sarah Chen had always been drawn to helping others, even as a child growing up in small-town Ohio. Her parents often found her bandaging the neighborhood cats or trying to nurse injured birds back to health. So when she graduated from nursing school at 23, nobody was surprised when she announced her intention to join Doctors Without Borders. What did surprise them was her decision to volunteer for one of the most dangerous assignments available, a medical mission in the war-torn region of eastern Kamalistan. The country had been ravaged by civil war for over a decade. Government forces battled rebel groups across mountainous terrain, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire with limited access to medical care. Sarah's mission was to work at a small field hospital in the village of Zara, located in a contested zone where control shifted between factions almost weekly. The hospital served both civilians and wounded soldiers from all sides, a neutral ground that both armies supposedly respected. Sarah arrived in Zara on a humid Tuesday morning in June, traveling in a convoy of white medical vehicles marked with red crosses. The village sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills dotted with olive trees and scrub brush. Most of the buildings were made of sun-baked clay bricks, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes from previous battles. The hospital itself was a modest two-story structure that had once been a school, its classrooms converted into wards and operating rooms. Dr. Ahmed Qasim, the hospital's chief physician, greeted Sarah at the entrance. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that held the weight of too much suffering. "Welcome to our little sanctuary," he said with a weary smile. "I hope you're prepared for what you'll see here. This isn't the comfortable hospitals you're used to in America." Sarah nodded, adjusting her medical bag on her shoulder. "I've trained for this. I want to help however I can." The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and deeply fulfilling. Sarah worked 12-hour shifts, treating everything from gunshot wounds to malaria, from broken bones to severe malnutrition in children. She learned to work with limited supplies, improvising when necessary and making every bandage and dose of medicine count. The local staff, nurses, orderlies, and translators welcomed her warmly, teaching her basic phrases in the local language and sharing their meals of flatbread and goat stew. Among the staff was Amira, a young woman about Sarah's age who worked as a translator and nurse's aide. Despite the language barrier, the two women quickly became close friends. Amira would teach Sarah about local customs during their brief breaks, while Sarah shared stories about life in America. They often worked side by side during the night shifts, their friendship providing comfort during the most difficult cases. The village of Zara had a population of about 3,000 people, most of whom lived simple lives as farmers or herders. Despite the ongoing war, there was a sense of community that touched Sarah deeply. Neighbors looked out for each other, sharing food during shortages and providing shelter to displaced families. Children still played in the dusty streets, their laughter a defiant sound against the distant rumble of artillery. Sarah made a point of learning about each patient she treated. There was old Hassan, a farmer who had lost his leg to a landmine while tending his sheep. Maria, a mother of 4 whose husband had been killed in a bombing, now struggled to feed her children alone. Young Tariq, barely 16, who had been conscripted by government forces and arrived at the hospital with shrapnel wounds and eyes that had seen too much. Each story broke Sarah's heart a little more, but also strengthened her resolve to help. She worked through her exhaustion, learning to function on just a few hours of sleep. Dr. Qasim often had to remind her to take breaks and eat something. "You cannot pour from an empty cup," he would tell her gently. "Take care of yourself so you can take care of others." The hospital operated under a strict neutrality policy. They treated anyone who came through their doors, regardless of which side of the conflict they fought for. Government soldiers lay in beds next to rebel fighters, their weapons checked at the door. It was an uneasy peace, but one that had held for over 2 years since the hospital's establishment. This neutrality was tested daily. Military officers from both sides would occasionally visit, demanding information about enemy wounded or insisting that their fighters receive priority treatment. Dr. Qasim handled these situations with diplomatic skill, firmly but politely explaining the hospital's position while never compromising patient care. Sarah began to understand the complex dynamics of the conflict during her 5th week in Zara. The war wasn't simply government versus rebels, there were ethnic and religious divisions that went back generations, grievances over land and resources, and interference from neighboring countries that had their own interests in the region's stability. Families were split, with brothers sometimes fighting on opposite sides. Despite the challenges, Sarah found moments of genuine joy in her work. She helped deliver 3 babies during her time in Zara, each birth a symbol of hope in a place where death was too common. She watched Hassan learn to walk again with a prosthetic leg, his determination inspiring everyone around him. She saw Maria gradually smile again as her youngest son recovered from a severe respiratory infection. The warning signs began appearing in early August. Radio chatter suggested that a major offensive was being planned by government forces to retake several rebel-held territories, including the area around Zara. Evacuation plans were quietly discussed among the senior staff, though no official decision was made. Dr. Qasim believed their neutral status would protect them, as it had in the past. Sarah noticed increased military activity in the surrounding hills. Helicopters flew overhead more frequently, and the sound of distant explosions became more common. Village residents began leaving, loading their possessions onto donkey carts and heading toward what they hoped would be safer areas. The hospital census dropped as local patients were discharged early or transferred to facilities farther from the front lines. On August 15, everything changed. Sarah was working the night shift with Amira when they heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The first explosion shattered windows throughout the hospital. Patients screamed, and those who could walk began scrambling for cover. Dr. Qasim rushed through the wards, shouting for everyone to move patients away from windows and into the most protected areas of the building. The bombardment continued for nearly an hour. Sarah and Amira worked frantically to move critically injured patients to safety, dragging stretchers through corridors filled with smoke and falling debris. A mortar round struck the hospital's generator, plunging them into darkness except for battery-powered emergency lights. When the shelling finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the village. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she checked on patients in the dim light. Several had been injured by flying glass and debris, but, miraculously, no one had been killed. Dr. Qasim gathered the staff in what remained of the main ward. "They're targeting us specifically," he said grimly. "This wasn't random fire. Someone has decided we're no longer neutral." Through the damaged windows, they could see fires burning throughout the village. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, heavy trucks and armored personnel carriers. Dr. Qasim made a quick decision. "Everyone who can leave must go now. Take the vehicles and head for the checkpoint at Al Rashid. Don't wait for official orders." The evacuation happened quickly but not smoothly. In the chaos, vehicles were overloaded with staff and the most critical patients. Sarah found herself helping to load stretchers into the back of an ambulance when she realized Amira was missing. "Where's Amira?" she asked one of the orderlies. "She went back for the medical records," he replied. "Said we needed them for the patients." Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Against direct orders, she ran back into the damaged hospital to find her friend. She found Amira in the collapsed administrative office, trapped under a fallen beam. The young woman was conscious but her leg was badly pinned. "Sarah, you have to go," Amira gasped. "Leave me. Get yourself to safety." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said firmly, trying to figure out how to lift the heavy concrete beam. Outside, they could hear vehicles departing and the sound of approaching soldiers getting closer. Sarah worked desperately to free Amira, using a metal rod as a lever to try to raise the beam. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she managed to create enough space for Amira to crawl out. But Amira's leg was badly damaged, and she could barely stand. Sarah supported her friend as they made their way toward the hospital's rear exit. Through a window, she could see the last of the medical vehicles disappearing down the road. They were too late. As they reached the back door, the sound of boots and shouting voices filled the front of the hospital. Sarah realized with growing horror that they were trapped. The evacuation had left without them, and hostile forces now controlled the village. She helped Amira hide behind an overturned supply cabinet in what had been a storage room. The soldiers who entered the hospital were wearing government uniforms, but their behavior was unlike any professional military force. They shouted angrily as they searched through the empty wards, overturning beds and smashing equipment. Sarah could hear them arguing about finding the foreign spy. Apparently, someone had told them an American nurse was working at the hospital. Sarah held her breath as footsteps approached their hiding spot. Through a gap in the cabinet, she could see Boots just inches away. Amira was losing consciousness from blood loss, and Sarah pressed her hand over her friend's mouth to muffle any sound. The soldiers eventually moved on to other parts of the building, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they conducted a more thorough search. She needed to get Amira medical attention, but they were now trapped behind enemy lines with no communication and no way to signal for help. As dawn broke over the destroyed village, Sarah faced the most terrifying moment of her life. She was alone in hostile territory with a critically injured friend, no supplies, and no way to contact the outside world. The mission that had begun with such hope and purpose had turned into a nightmare of survival. Through the broken windows, she could see government soldiers setting up checkpoints throughout the village. Radio chatter suggested they planned to use Zara as a forward base for their offensive against rebel positions in the surrounding hills. Any civilian found in the area would be considered a potential enemy combatant. Sarah looked at Amira's pale face and made a promise that she would somehow get them both out of this situation. She had no idea how she would keep that promise, but she knew she had to try. The woman who had come to Zara to save lives was now fighting to save her own life and the life of her dearest friend. The real test of Sarah's courage and resourcefulness was just beginning. Everything she had learned about medicine, survival, and human nature would be put to the ultimate test in the days ahead. She was no longer just a nurse treating patients, she was now a refugee fighting for survival in a war zone where the rules of civilization no longer applied. As she sat in the ruins of the hospital, holding her injured friend and listening to the sounds of an occupying army, Sarah Chin began planning the most important mission of her life, getting home alive. The first 48 hours after the evacuation were the longest of Sarah's life. She and Amira remained hidden in the damaged storage room, surviving on water from a broken pipe and crackers she found in an overturned supply box. Amira drifted in and out of consciousness, her injured leg swollen and clearly infected. Sarah knew her friend needed proper medical treatment soon, but venturing outside meant almost certain capture. On the second night, Sarah made a desperate decision. Using supplies salvaged from the destroyed hospital, she performed surgery on Amira's leg by flashlight. With no anesthesia except aspirin tablets and no sterile conditions, she cleaned the wound as best she could and set the broken bone using wooden splints torn from damaged furniture. Amira bit down on a strip of cloth to muffle her screams, tears streaming down both women's faces. "You're going to be okay," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The infection was spreading, and, without antibiotics, Amira's condition would only worsen. During daylight hours, Sarah observed the soldiers' patterns through cracks in the wall. The government forces had indeed established a base in the village, with their headquarters in the old community center across the street from the hospital. Patrols moved through the area regularly, but their searches of the hospital had become less frequent after the first day. On the third morning, Sarah heard voices approaching their hiding spot. She pressed herself and Amira deeper behind the cabinet as two soldiers entered the storage room. They were speaking in the local language, which Sarah had only learned basic phrases of, but their tone suggested they were discussing something important. One of the soldiers kicked at some debris near their hiding place, and Sarah held her breath. After what felt like an eternity, the men left, but not before one of them mentioned something about civilians and questioning. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized they might be planning to search more thoroughly for any locals who had remained in the village. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that terrified her but seemed like their only option. They couldn't stay hidden much longer, and Amira needed medicine urgently. She would have to venture outside and somehow blend in with any remaining villagers. But first, she needed a disguise. Among the scattered items in the hospital, Sarah found a dark headscarf and loose clothing that had belonged to one of the local nurses. She changed out of her Western clothes and practiced wrapping the headscarf the way she had seen Amira and other local women do it. Looking at herself in a broken mirror, she hoped the disguise might work from a distance, at least long enough to gather information about escape routes. As evening approached, Sarah made her first reconnaissance trip outside the hospital. She left Amira with water and the few remaining aspirin tablets, promising to return within 2 hours. Her heart pounded as she slipped out through a hole in the back wall and made her way through the rubble-strewn streets of Zara. The village was almost unrecognizable. Many buildings had been damaged by shelling, and government vehicles were parked throughout the main square. Soldiers lounged in the shade, smoking cigarettes and cleaning their weapons. Sarah kept her head down and walked purposefully, trying to appear like a local woman going about her daily business. Near what had been the village market, she encountered her first real test. A soldier called out to her in the local language. Sarah's heart nearly stopped, but she forced herself to turn slowly. The man was young, probably not much older than herself, with tired eyes and a week's worth of stubble. He asked her something she couldn't understand, gesturing toward a damaged building. Sarah nodded and mumbled what she hoped sounded like an appropriate response in the local dialect. The soldier studied her face for a moment that seemed to last forever, then waved her on. As she continued through the village, Sarah began to piece together the situation. Most of the civilians had indeed fled, but a few elderly residents and families with no means of transportation had remained. The soldiers seemed to be treating these remaining villagers as potential sources of information about rebel activities, questioning them regularly but not harming them outright. She also discovered something that gave her hope. There was still a functioning well in the center of the village where the remaining civilians gathered water twice daily. This could provide her with opportunities to gather information and possibly make contact with locals who might help them. Sarah found what she was looking for near the edge of the village, a small pharmacy that had been looted but not completely destroyed. Working quickly in the fading daylight, she searched through the scattered medicines and supplies. Most of the valuable drugs had been taken, but she managed to find a few bottles of antibiotics that had been overlooked, along with bandages and basic medical supplies. The return journey to the hospital was even more nerve-wracking. She took a different route, staying in the shadows and moving from building to building. Twice she had to hide as patrols passed by, pressing herself against walls and praying that the darkness would conceal her. When she finally made it back to Amira, her friend was running a high fever. Sarah immediately started her on the antibiotics and changed her bandages with the new supplies. Amira was delirious, mumbling in her native language and calling out for her mother. "Stay with me," Sarah whispered, cooling Amira's forehead with water. "I'm going to get us out of here, but I need you to fight this infection." Over the next few days, Sarah established a routine that allowed her to gather information while caring for Amira. She would venture out during the evening water collection times, blending in with the remaining villagers at the well. Her limited language skills were actually an advantage. Many of the villagers spoke several local dialects, so her halting speech didn't immediately mark her as foreign. Through careful listening and simple conversations, Sarah learned crucial information about the military situation. The government forces were using Zara as a staging area for attacks on rebel positions in the surrounding hills. Supply convoys arrived every few days, bringing food, ammunition, and fuel. More importantly, she learned about the patrol schedules and the locations of checkpoints on all the roads leading out of the village. An elderly woman named Fatima became Sarah's unwitting source of local knowledge. Fatima had lived in Zara her entire life and knew every path and hiding place in the surrounding countryside. During their brief conversations at the well, she would mention which routes the soldiers were watching and where it might be safe to travel. Sarah also learned about the fate of the hospital staff who had evacuated. According to local gossip, they had made it safely to the checkpoint at Al-Rashid and were eventually transported to the capital. This knowledge was both relief and torture. Her colleagues were safe, but they probably assumed she and Amira were dead. As Amira slowly began to recover from her infection, Sarah started planning their escape. The main roads were heavily patrolled, with checkpoints every few kilometers. But Fatima had mentioned an old shepherd's path that wound through the hills toward the neutral zone controlled by international peacekeepers. The path was difficult and would require at least 3 days of walking, but it might be their only chance. The challenge was that Amira, despite her improvement, was still weak and could barely walk short distances. Any escape attempt would require her to be able to travel rough terrain for hours at a time. Sarah began helping her friend exercise in secret, supporting her as she took small walks around their hiding place during the dark hours before dawn. 2 weeks after the evacuation, Sarah's careful routine was nearly shattered when a new commander arrived in Zara. Unlike the previous officers, Colonel Rashid was methodical and suspicious. He immediately ordered a complete search of every building in the village, including areas that had been ignored previously. Sarah watched through a crack in the wall as soldiers approached the hospital with metal detectors and probing equipment. She and Amira had perhaps 30 minutes before their hiding place would be discovered. In a desperate move, Sarah helped Amira climb through a hole in the wall into the adjacent building, which had been completely destroyed by shelling. They spent the next several hours buried under rubble in what had once been someone's home, listening as soldiers moved through the hospital just meters away. Sarah could hear them discussing the evidence that someone had been living in the storage room, the makeshift bedding, empty food containers, and medical supplies. "Someone was definitely here," one soldier said in accented English, apparently for the colonel's benefit. "Probably within the last few days." Colonel Rashid's response chilled Sarah's blood. "Then, they're still in the village. No one gets out without my permission. Double the patrols and search every building again." I want whoever was hiding here found within 24 hours. That night, after the soldiers had moved on to other areas, Sarah and Amira made their way to a new hiding place in the ruins of the village mosque. The building had been damaged but not destroyed, and its thick walls provided better concealment than their previous location. More importantly, it was close to the edge of the village, offering potential access to the hillside paths. The increased security made Sarah's information-gathering trips much more dangerous, but they also provided her with crucial intelligence. She learned that Colonel Rashid was planning to move his forces out of Zara within the week, advancing toward rebel positions deeper in the mountains. This would leave the village more lightly defended, but it also meant their window for escape was closing rapidly. During one of her evening ventures, Sarah noticed something that gave her an idea. A supply convoy was scheduled to arrive the following night, bringing food and medical supplies for the forward base. The trucks would park near the village center overnight before continuing to other military positions in the morning. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was incredibly risky, but it might be their only chance. If she and Amira could somehow hide in one of the supply trucks, they might be able to get past the checkpoints and closer to friendly territory. The challenge would be getting close enough to the convoy without being detected, and then surviving a journey of unknown duration hidden among military supplies. Sarah spent the next day observing the convoy's arrival and the soldiers' procedures for securing the vehicles. She noticed that the trucks were searched when they arrived but not when they departed. The soldiers trusted their own security too much to imagine anyone could infiltrate their base. As she watched the preparations for what she hoped would be their escape, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since arriving in Zara. The idealistic young nurse who had wanted to save the world had become someone who could perform surgery without anesthesia, lie convincingly to armed soldiers, and plan military-style escape operations. War had a way of bringing out capabilities she never knew she possessed. That evening, as she prepared Amira for what would be their most dangerous night yet, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. If they survived this ordeal and made it home, she would never take her freedom for granted again. She would also never forget the courage and dignity of people like Amira, Fatima, and the other villagers who had shown kindness to a stranger even in their darkest hours. The escape attempt would begin in just a few hours, and Sarah knew that by dawn, they would either be on their way to freedom or captured by Colonel Rashid's forces. Either way, their time hiding in the ruins of Zara was coming to an end. The next phase of their survival would test not just Sarah's courage and resourcefulness, but also the strength of the friendship that had sustained them both through their darkest moments. The supply convoy arrived at sunset, just as Sarah had observed during her reconnaissance. 5 heavy trucks loaded with food, medical supplies, and ammunition parked in formation near the village center. Sarah watched from their hiding place in the mosque ruins as soldiers unloaded some of the cargo and conducted their routine security check of the vehicle's exteriors. Amira was as ready as she could be under the circumstances. Her leg was still weak, but she could walk short distances without assistance. Sarah had fashioned a crude crutch from a piece of wooden debris, which would help Amira move more quickly when necessary. They had no food except a few crackers and a bottle of water, but Sarah reasoned they wouldn't need supplies if their plan worked, and if it failed, supplies wouldn't matter anyway. "Are you sure about this?" Amira whispered as they prepared to leave their hiding place. Despite her improved condition, she was still pale and obviously weak. "No," Sarah admitted honestly. "But it's our best chance. Maybe our only chance." They waited until after midnight, when the guard rotation would be at its most relaxed. Sarah had observed that the soldiers became less vigilant during the early morning hours, especially on routine nights when no enemy activity was expected. The convoy was scheduled to depart at dawn, giving them perhaps 5 hours to reach the trucks and find hiding places. Moving through the darkened village was like navigating a minefield. Every shadow could conceal a guard, every sound might alert the patrols. Sarah supported Amira as they made their way from building to building, using the rubble and damaged walls as cover. Progress was painfully slow, with frequent stops to listen for approaching footsteps or voices. They had covered about half the distance to the trucks when disaster nearly struck. A patrol of 3 soldiers appeared from behind a damaged building, their path intersecting directly with Sarah and Amira's route. With nowhere to hide and no time to retreat, Sarah made a desperate decision. She pulled Amira into the shadow of a partially collapsed wall and pressed them both flat against the ground behind a pile of debris. The soldiers passed within 3 meters of their hiding spot, close enough that Sarah could hear one of them humming a tune under his breath. She held her breath until the patrol was completely out of sight, her heart beating so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the village. Too close, Amira breathed when they were finally alone again. "We keep going," Sarah replied, though her hands were shaking. "We're committed now." The final approach to the convoy required crossing an open area near the village square. During daylight, this space was constantly monitored, but at night only one guard was posted near the trucks. Sarah observed his pattern for 20 minutes, noting that he made a circuit around the vehicles every 10 minutes, spending most of his time near the lead truck. When the guard began his next circuit, Sarah and Amira made their move. They crawled across the open ground, using abandoned market stalls and debris for concealment. Amira's injured leg made the crawling difficult and slow, but they managed to reach the shadow of the nearest truck just as the guard completed his round. The truck they reached was the third in the convoy, loaded with medical supplies and food rations. Sarah helped Amira climb onto the truck's rear platform, then carefully opened the canvas covering. Inside, boxes and crates were stacked neatly, leaving little space for passengers. But near the front of the truck bed, behind some large containers, there was a gap just large enough for two people to squeeze into. Getting into position without disturbing the cargo required careful maneuvering. Every box they moved had to be replaced exactly as they found it, and they had to work in complete silence. Sarah's medical training proved valuable here. Her steady hands and experience working in tight spaces helped her navigate the challenge. Once they were hidden behind the cargo, Sarah arranged the boxes to create a small air pocket while still concealing them from casual observation. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, barely large enough for them to lie side by side, but it would have to do. They settled in to wait for dawn, knowing they had perhaps 4 hours before the convoy departed. The truck smelled of diesel fuel and canvas, mixed with the odors of the various supplies surrounding them. Every sound from outside made Sarah tense, as footsteps, voices, the occasional radio chatter from the guards. Around 3 a.m., Sarah heard increased activity outside. She could make out the voices of officers conducting a final inspection of the convoy. Footsteps approached their truck, and she heard someone climbing onto the platform. A flashlight beam swept across the cargo area, passing just inches from their hiding spot. "Everything secure back here," a voice called out. The inspection was apparently routine, because the officer didn't move any of the cargo or probe deeply into the shadows. After a few more minutes, the footsteps retreated. As dawn approached, the level of activity around the convoy increased dramatically. Engines started, radios crackled with communications, and soldiers called out to each other as they prepared for departure. Sarah felt their truck lurch slightly as the driver climbed into the cab. The convoy began moving just as the sun appeared over the eastern hills. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror as the truck rolled out of Zara, relief that they had successfully escaped the village, terror about what lay ahead. She had no idea where the convoy was going, how long the journey would take, or what would happen when they reached their destination. The road out of Zara was rough and poorly maintained, causing the truck to bounce and sway constantly. The movement made their cramped hiding space even more uncomfortable, and Sarah worried about Amira's injured leg being jarred by the constant motion. But Amira endured the discomfort without complaint, understanding that any sound could reveal their presence. After about an hour of travel, the convoy stopped at what Sarah assumed was a military checkpoint. She could hear voices outside, documents being exchanged, and the sound of other vehicles. The inspection seemed routine, and after 15 minutes they were moving again. The second stop came after another 2 hours of travel. This time, the engines were shut off, and Sarah could hear soldiers dismounting from the vehicles. Through the canvas covering, she glimpsed sunlight and heard birds singing. They had stopped in a more natural setting, probably for a rest and meal break. This presented a new danger. With soldiers outside the trucks, any movement or sound from the cargo area would be immediately noticed. Sarah and Amira lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as voices and footsteps moved around their vehicle. Someone climbed onto their truck's platform again, and Sarah's heart stopped as she heard boxes being moved. "Need some of the medical supplies," a voice said. "Colonel wants the morphine inventory checked." Boxes were shifted just meters from their hiding place. Sarah could see boots through gaps in their concealment as the soldiers searched for specific supplies. For several terrifying minutes, she was certain they would be discovered. But their carefully arranged hiding spot held, and eventually the soldier found what he was looking for and left. The break lasted nearly an hour, during which Sarah and Amira remained frozen in position. The heat in their hiding space became almost unbearable, and Amira was showing signs of distress from the combination of her injury and the cramped conditions. Sarah rationed their water carefully, giving Amira small sips when she could do so without making noise. When the convoy resumed its journey, Sarah tried to keep track of their direction and approximate travel time. The road became smoother, suggesting they were on a more major route. She heard the sounds of other traffic, civilian vehicles and, possibly other military convoys. This gave her hope that they might be approaching an area with more international presence. The third stop came in the early afternoon. This time, the activity outside suggested they had reached their destination. Engines were shut off permanently, and there was the organized bustle of soldiers unloading equipment and establishing a temporary base. Sarah heard orders being shouted and the sound of heavy equipment being moved. Through gaps in the canvas, she caught glimpses of a valley surrounded by hills, definitely not the same terrain as around Zara. The vegetation was greener, and she could hear the sound of running water nearby. But, more importantly, she noticed that some of the voices outside were speaking English with international accents, possibly peacekeepers or international observers. As the unloading continued, Sarah realized they faced a critical decision. They could remain hidden and hope the truck would eventually move to a location closer to friendly forces, or they could try to slip away during the confusion of establishing the new base. Both options carried enormous risks. The decision was made for them when soldiers began systematically unloading their truck. Sarah heard cargo being moved from the rear of the vehicle, working steadily toward their hiding place. In perhaps 30 minutes, their concealment would be completely removed. "We have to go now," Sarah whispered to Amira. "When I give the signal, we move fast toward those trees on the left." Through a tear in the canvas, Sarah could see a line of trees about 50 meters from the convoy. If they could reach the tree line without being seen, they might have a chance to disappear into the forest. It was a desperate plan, but they had run out of alternatives. Sarah waited until most of the soldiers were busy with equipment on the other side of the convoy. When she saw a brief moment with no one watching their truck directly, she helped Amira climb down from the vehicle. They moved as quickly as Amira's injury allowed, using other trucks and equipment for concealment. They had covered about half the distance to the trees when a shout rang out behind them. Someone had discovered their hiding place and raised the alarm. Sarah heard boots running and voices calling out orders to stop. She grabbed Amira's arm and they ran, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Gunshots cracked behind them as they reached the edge of the forest. Sarah heard bullets whistle past, striking trees just ahead of them. They plunged into the undergrowth, branches tearing at their clothes and faces. Amira was struggling with her injured leg, but adrenaline kept her moving. Behind them, they could hear soldiers crashing through the forest in pursuit. Dogs were barking, tracking dogs brought in to hunt them down. Sarah realized they had perhaps a few minutes head start before the organized search would begin in earnest. "This way," she gasped, helping Amira up a steep slope between the trees. "We need to get to higher ground." As they climbed desperately through the forest, Sarah knew their escape from the convoy had only bought them temporary freedom. They were now fugitives being actively hunted by professional soldiers with dogs and radio communications. The forest might provide temporary concealment, but it was also unfamiliar territory where they could easily become lost. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Their desperate flight from Zara had taken another dangerous turn, and Sarah realized the most challenging part of their journey was yet to come. Everything depended now on their ability to disappear into the wilderness and somehow find their way to safety before their pursuers tracked them down. The woman who had once saved lives in a comfortable hospital was now running for her life through hostile territory, carrying her injured friend toward an uncertain fate. But, despite the fear and exhaustion, Sarah felt a grim determination growing within her. She had come too far and survived too much to give up now. Whatever it took, she would find a way to get them both home. The forest was dense and unforgiving. Ancient oak and pine trees created a canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the ground, leaving Sarah and Amira stumbling through a twilight world of shadows and undergrowth. They had been running for nearly 2 hours, driven by the sound of pursuit that seemed to echo from every direction. Amira was struggling badly. Her injured leg had reopened during their desperate flight, and blood was seeping through the makeshift bandage Sarah had applied weeks ago. Every step was agony, but she pushed forward without complaint, understanding that stopping meant capture or death. "We need to find water," Sarah gasped as they paused behind a massive fallen log. "And we need to treat your leg before infection sets in again." The sounds of their pursuers had faded somewhat, but Sarah knew the soldiers were still hunting them. The barking of tracking dogs came and went on the wind, sometimes seeming close, other times distant. She realized the thick forest and rocky terrain was probably interfering with the dog's ability to follow their scent trail consistently. As they continued deeper into the wilderness, Sarah began to notice landmarks that gave her hope. The mountain ridge to their north was familiar from maps she had studied during her time in Zara. If she was right about their location, they were roughly 15 kilometers from the neutral zone controlled by United Nations peacekeepers. But 15 kilometers through hostile territory with limited supplies and an injured companion might as well have been 1,500. They found the water source they desperately needed just as daylight was beginning to fade. A small stream wound between moss-covered rocks, its water clear and cold. Sarah helped Amira sit beside the stream while she examined her friend's injured leg. The wound had indeed reopened, and, without proper medical supplies, Sarah had to improvise once again. Using strips torn from her clothing, Sarah cleaned the wound as best she could with stream water. She had no antiseptic, no clean bandages, and no pain medication to offer Amira. All she could do was apply pressure to stop the bleeding and wrap the leg as tightly as possible with the cloth strips. "I'm slowing you down," Amira whispered, tears mixing with the dirt and sweat on her face. "You could move faster without me." "Don't even think that," Sarah replied firmly. "We started this together, and we're going to finish it together." As darkness settled over the forest, they faced a critical decision about where to spend the night. Sleeping in the open made them vulnerable to discovery, but the dense undergrowth also concealed dangerous wildlife and made movement difficult in the dark. Sarah chose a location under the roots of a massive upturned tree, where erosion had created a small cave-like shelter. They had no food except a handful of berries Sarah had gathered during their trek. She wasn't entirely sure the berries were safe to eat, but hunger was becoming as immediate a threat as their pursuers. They rationed their water carefully, knowing they might not find another clean source for days. The night was filled with sounds that made sleep nearly impossible. Owls called from the treetops, something large crashed through the undergrowth nearby, and twice Sarah heard what sounded like voices in the distance. She and Amira took turns staying awake, listening for any sign that the search was getting closer. Dawn brought new challenges but also unexpected hope. As Sarah emerged from their shelter to scout the surrounding area, she discovered they were not alone in the forest. An elderly man was gathering firewood near the stream, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who knew the wilderness intimately. Sarah watched him for several minutes before making a decision that could either save them or doom them. She approached the man slowly, hands visible and posture non-threatening. When he noticed her, his eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't flee or cry out for help. "Please," Sarah said in her limited grasp of the local language. "Help!" The man studied her torn clothing, her obvious exhaustion, and the desperation in her eyes. After a moment that seemed to last forever, he gestured for her to follow him. Sarah quickly returned to get Amira, and together they followed their unexpected guide deeper into the forest. The old man led them to a small cabin hidden in a grove of pine trees, so well concealed that Sarah would have walked past it without noticing. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a small garden plot showed evidence of careful cultivation. This was someone who had chosen to live apart from the war that was tearing the country apart. Inside the cabin, an elderly woman was preparing a simple breakfast of bread and goat cheese. She took one look at Amira's condition and immediately began preparing hot water and clean cloth. Without speaking, she gestured for Sarah to help her treat Amira's wound properly. The couple, who introduced themselves as Ibrahim and Nadia, had lived in the forest for over 30 years. They had moved to this remote location when the first signs of civil unrest began, preferring isolation to the growing violence in the villages. They survived by hunting, growing vegetables, and occasionally trading with other isolated families scattered throughout the mountains. Ibrahim spoke enough broken English to communicate basic information with Sarah. He confirmed that they were indeed close to the neutral zone, but warned that the direct route was heavily patrolled by both government forces and rebel groups. However, he knew alternative paths through the mountains that were used by smugglers and refugees. "Dangerous," he warned. 3 days walking. Maybe 4 with hurt leg. But soldiers not go there. Too steep, too hidden. Nadia insisted on providing them with proper medical care before they attempted the mountain crossing. She cleaned and dressed Amira's wound with herbs that had antibiotic properties, and prepared a tincture that would help fight infection. She also cooked them the first real meal they had eaten in days, rabbit stew with vegetables from her garden. For the first time since the evacuation from Zara, Sarah felt a glimmer of real hope. These kind people were risking their own safety to help two strangers, asking nothing in return except that Sarah and Amira be careful on the dangerous journey ahead. That evening, Ibrahim drew a detailed map in the dirt outside his cabin, showing Sarah the route through the mountains. He marked water sources, dangerous areas to avoid, and landmarks that would help them navigate. The path would take them through high mountain passes where the air was thin and the weather unpredictable, but it would also bypass all military activity. Follow stream up mountain, Ibrahim explained, pointing to various features on his improvised map. Then, ridge path to Eagle Rock. 2 days. After Eagle Rock, down to valley where blue helmets wait. Sarah studied the route carefully, committing every detail to memory. She had no paper to copy the map, so she would have to rely on her ability to remember Ibrahim's instructions. A wrong turn in the mountains could mean death from exposure or starvation. Nadia packed them supplies for the journey: bread, dried meat, a small pot for cooking, and herbs for treating Amira's wound. She also provided them with warmer clothing and sturdy boots that would be essential for mountain travel. The couple had little to spare, but they shared what they could with generosity that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. On their second morning in the cabin, the tranquil atmosphere was shattered by the distant sound of helicopters. Ibrahim immediately began covering evidence of their presence, smoothing the dirt where the map had been drawn, hiding the extra clothing they had worn, and preparing the cabin to appear uninhabited. "Government search," he said grimly. "Looking for you. Must go now, before they come close." Sarah's heart sank as she realized their brief respite was over. Amira was stronger after 2 days of rest and proper food, but she was far from fully recovered. The mountain crossing would test her endurance to its limits, but they had no choice. Ibrahim led them to the beginning of the mountain trail, a narrow path that wound upward through dense forest toward rocky peaks that seemed impossibly distant. At the trailhead, he pointed out the first landmark, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant. "Remember," he told Sarah seriously. "Stay on path. Do not leave path, even if lost. Mountain has many dangerous places. People disappear." Sarah hugged both Ibrahim and Nadia, overwhelmed by gratitude for their kindness. In a world torn apart by war and hatred, these two people had restored her faith in basic human goodness. They had risked their own safety to help strangers, motivated by nothing more than compassion. As Sarah and Amira began the steep climb into the mountains, the sound of helicopters grew louder behind them. Sarah looked back once to see the aircraft circling over the area where Ibrahim's cabin was hidden. She prayed that their rescuers would remain safe and undetected. The mountain trail was immediately challenging. Within the first hour, they had climbed higher than Sarah had ever been in her life. The air grew thinner, making every breath an effort, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they gained elevation. Amira struggled with the steep inclines, but her determination was remarkable. By midday, they had reached a high plateau where the forest gave way to open meadows dotted with wildflowers. The view was breathtaking, rolling mountains stretched to the horizon in every direction, and Sarah could see the valley far below where they had started their climb. But the beauty was overshadowed by the realization of how far they still had to go. They rested beside a mountain stream, eating some of Nadia's bread and refilling their water bottles. Sarah changed Amira's bandage and was relieved to see that the wound was healing cleanly. The herbs and rest had worked better than any modern medicine could have under the circumstances. "How much farther?" Amira asked, looking up at the rocky peaks that still loomed above them. "We're not even halfway," Sarah admitted. "But we're making good progress. And every step takes us closer to safety." As afternoon wore on, the weather began to change. Clouds gathered around the mountain peaks, and Sarah felt the first drops of rain. Ibrahim had warned them about the mountain weather, how quickly conditions could change from pleasant to life-threatening. They needed to find shelter before the full storm hit. They found a small cave in a rocky outcrop just as the rain began falling in earnest. The cave was dry but cold, barely large enough for both of them to lie down. As thunder echoed through the mountains and lightning illuminated the peaks around them, Sarah realized they were truly on their own now. The storm raged through the night, but it also provided cover for their journey. Any helicopters or ground patrols searching for them would be grounded by the weather, giving them precious time to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. As Sarah listened to the wind howling outside their small shelter, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this remote mountain cave. 3 weeks ago, she had been a nurse working in a field hospital. Now she was a fugitive crossing hostile mountains with skills she never knew she possessed. The most dangerous part of their escape was still ahead, 2 more days of mountain travel to reach the Eagle Rock Ibrahim had described, then, the treacherous descent into the valley where UN peacekeepers maintained their base. But, for the first time since the evacuation from Zara, Sarah truly believed they might make it home alive. The storm would pass, and tomorrow they would continue their climb toward freedom. The woman who had once dedicated her life to healing others was now fighting to save herself and her closest friend, using courage and determination she had discovered in the crucible of war. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the mountains, Sarah was ready to face them. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the mountain air crisp and clear. Sarah woke to find Amira already awake, staring out at the vast landscape spread below them. Despite everything they had endured, or perhaps because of it, there was something peaceful about watching the sunrise paint the distant valleys in shades of gold and amber. "I dreamed about home last night," Amira said quietly. "My mother's cooking, my little sister's laugh. It felt so real I could almost smell the bread baking." Sarah understood the longing in her friend's voice. She had been having similar dreams about her small apartment in Ohio, about Sunday dinners with her parents, about the simple pleasure of a hot shower and a soft bed. These memories had become more precious than gold during their ordeal. They ate a sparse breakfast of bread and dried meat from Nadia's supplies, then began the day's climb toward the Eagle Rock landmark Ibrahim had described. The trail became increasingly difficult as they gained elevation, winding through loose scree slopes and across narrow ledges where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. Amira's progress was slower than the previous day, and Sarah could see that her friend was struggling more with each hour that passed. The high altitude, combined with the lingering effects of her injury, was taking a toll that Amira tried hard to hide. But Sarah had learned to read the signs, the way Amira favored her good leg more heavily, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. Around midday, they reached a section of the trail that had been damaged by a recent rockslide. A gap of perhaps 3 meters separated stable ground on either side of the slide area. Below the gap, loose rocks fell away into a ravine so deep that Sarah couldn't see the bottom. "I can't make that jump," Amira said, stating what they both knew to be true. Her injured leg would never support the landing, and failure would mean certain death. Sarah studied the problem from every angle. The gap was too wide to bridge with anything they could find, and going around would require backtracking several kilometers and finding an alternative route that might not exist. As she examined the rock face above the slide, she noticed something that gave her an idea. A sturdy pine tree grew from a crack in the rock about 4 meters above the trail. If they could reach the tree, its trunk was thick enough to support their weight as they worked their way around the slide area. The challenge was getting to the tree in the first place. Using her experience from rock climbing in college, Sarah found hand and footholds in the cliff face that would allow her to climb to the tree. It was dangerous, but no more dangerous than anything else they had faced. Once she reached the tree, she could secure their rope and help Amira make the climb more safely. Ibrahim had given them a length of rope with their supplies, though Sarah had wondered at the time why they would need it. Now she understood his wisdom. The mountain paths were full of challenges that required more than just determination to overcome. The climb to the tree was terrifying. Twice, handholds crumbled under Sarah's weight, sending rocks clattering into the ravine below. But her medical training had given her steady hands and good balance, skills that served her well on the treacherous rock face. After 20 minutes of careful climbing, she reached the pine tree and secured the rope around its trunk. Getting Amira up to the tree level required all of Sarah's strength and ingenuity. With the rope to assist her and Sarah providing guidance from above, Amira managed to make the climb despite her injury. The process was exhausting for both women, but it worked. From the tree, they were able to work their way around the slide area, using the rope for security as they traversed the unstable slope. When they finally regained the trail on the far side, both women collapsed in exhaustion, their hands bleeding from the rough rock and their bodies pushed to their limits. "We make a good team," Amira said with a weak smile as they rested in the shade of another pine tree. "The best," Sarah agreed, though she was worried about whether Amira would have the strength to complete the remaining distance to Eagle Rock. That afternoon, they encountered other travelers on the mountain path. A family of refugees was coming down from the higher elevations, their faces bearing the same exhausted desperation that Sarah had seen so often in Zara. The father carried a young child who appeared to be suffering from altitude sickness, while the mother led 2 other children who could barely walk. Without hesitation, Sarah stopped to help. The child's symptoms were serious, severe headaches, nausea, and difficulty breathing. At this altitude, cerebral edema was a real danger. Using her medical knowledge, Sarah advised the family on treatment and gave them some of Nadia's herbs that could help with the altitude sickness. "You must get him to lower elevation quickly," she told the father in her halting grasp of the local language. "Down is only medicine for mountain sickness." The family was pathetically grateful for her help, and the father insisted on sharing what little information he had about the trail ahead. Eagle Rock was still a full day's hard climbing away, he warned, and the weather in the high passes could change without warning. He also told them something that chilled Sarah's blood. Government patrols had been seen in the valley below the neutral zone, apparently trying to intercept refugees before they could reach UN protection. As they parted ways with the refugee family, Sarah realized their ordeal was far from over. Even if they successfully navigated the mountain crossing, they would still face the challenge of reaching the peacekeeping base without being captured by hostile forces. Late in the afternoon, they reached the tree line. Above them stretched a landscape of bare rock and thin air, forbidding and beautiful in its stark simplicity. The trail continued upward through this alien terrain, marked only by occasional cairns of stacked stones left by previous travelers. The temperature dropped dramatically as evening approached. Sarah had underestimated how cold the mountains could become, even in summer. They found shelter in a small depression between two large boulders, where they could build a tiny fire using scrub brush and dried grass. That night was the coldest and most miserable of their entire journey. Despite huddling together for warmth, both women shivered uncontrollably as the temperature plummeted well below freezing. Sarah worried that Amira might develop hypothermia, and she forced her friend to do exercises throughout the night to keep her circulation active. Dawn brought relief from the cold but revealed a new challenge. A thick layer of ice covered the rocks around their shelter, making the trail treacherous and slippery. Each step required careful placement to avoid a potentially fatal fall. Progress that morning was painfully slow. The combination of thin air, icy conditions, and Amira's weakening condition meant they covered only a few kilometers before stopping for rest. Sarah calculated that at this pace, they wouldn't reach Eagle Rock until late in the day, leaving them exposed on the mountain for another freezing night. It was just after noon when they finally saw it, a distinctive rock formation that matched Ibrahim's description perfectly. Eagle Rock jutted from the mountain like the head and beak of a massive bird of prey, unmistakable even from several kilometers away. The sight gave them both a surge of energy that carried them through the final approach. From Eagle Rock, they could see their destination. Far below in a green valley, the white vehicles and blue helmets of UN peacekeepers were visible through Sarah's small binoculars. The base looked impossibly distant, but it was real and achievable. The descent from Eagle Rock was in some ways more dangerous than the climb up. Loose scree slopes and steep switchbacks tested their balance and endurance with every step. Several times, small rockslides started by their passage sent stones cascading down the mountainside. Amira fell twice during the descent, her injured leg finally giving out completely. After the second fall, she couldn't put any weight on the leg at all. Sarah faced a terrible choice: abandon her friend and seek help, or find a way to carry Amira down the remaining distance to the valley floor. The decision was easy. Sarah had not come this far to leave Amira behind now. Using techniques she remembered from emergency medical training, she fashioned a travois from their remaining rope and some fallen branches. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed her to drag Amira down the gentler slopes while supporting her during the steeper sections. The final descent took them through forests similar to where they had started, but this time the trees provided welcome cover as they approached the danger zone near the valley floor. Sarah could hear vehicles moving along roads below, and voices calling out in multiple languages. They were perhaps 2 kilometers from the UN base when they encountered the government patrol the refugee family had warned them about. Sarah heard the vehicles before she saw them, 2 trucks moving slowly along the mountain road, obviously searching for something or someone. Hiding behind a fallen log, Sarah watched as soldiers deployed from the trucks and began setting up a checkpoint on the only road leading to the peacekeeping base. Anyone trying to reach UN protection would have to pass through this checkpoint, where refugees were being questioned and some were being detained. Sarah realized they needed a different approach. The direct route to the base was now impossible, but Ibrahim had mentioned that smugglers used various paths through this area. If she could find one of these alternative routes, they might be able to circle around the checkpoint. As darkness fell, Sarah made her final gamble. Leaving Amira hidden in the forest, she worked her way closer to the UN base, looking for a way to signal for help without alerting the government patrol. The peacekeepers would have night vision equipment and radio communications that could turn the situation in their favor. She found what she needed near a small stream that flowed toward the base. Using her flashlight to send Morse code signals, dots and dashes she remembered from childhood camping, Sarah spelled out SOS and American Medical repeatedly toward the peacekeeping compound. After 20 minutes of signaling, she saw an answering flash from the direction of the base. Someone had received her message. Within an hour, she heard vehicles approaching through the forest, UN vehicles moving without lights, guided by GPS and night vision equipment. The rescue was swift and professional. A team of peacekeepers led by a British officer found Sarah and extracted both women from the forest without alerting the government patrol. Within minutes, they were in armored vehicles speeding toward the safety of the base. As they passed through the base's fortified gates, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe they had made it. The nightmare that began with the evacuation from Zara was finally over. Medical personnel immediately took charge of Amira, whose condition had deteriorated seriously during the mountain crossing. 3 days later, both women were evacuated by helicopter to the capital, or a plane waited to take Sarah home to the United States. Amira would remain for surgery on her leg and recovery time with her family, but her prognosis was excellent. At the airport, as they prepared for their final separation, Amira took Sarah's hand. "You saved my life," she said simply. "More than once." "You saved mine too," Sarah replied, and she meant it. "We saved each other." The flight home gave Sarah time to process everything that had happened during her weeks behind enemy lines. She had gone to Kamalistan as an idealistic young nurse wanting to help others. She was returning as someone who understood that the world was more dangerous and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The small town in Ohio where she had grown up looked different when she finally arrived home. The houses seemed larger, the streets wider, the problems of daily life smaller and more manageable. Her parents cried when they saw her, having feared the worst when communications from the medical mission stopped abruptly. Sarah knew she would never be the same person who had left for Kamalistan months earlier. The experience had changed her in ways both obvious and subtle. She had learned that she was capable of far more courage and resourcefulness than she had ever imagined, but she had also learned the price of survival in a world where not everyone makes it home. She returned to nursing, but now she worked in emergency medicine where her unique experience proved invaluable. She never spoke publicly about her ordeal behind enemy lines, but she maintained correspondence with several organizations that helped refugees and war victims. Most importantly, she kept in touch with Amira, who eventually recovered fully and became a doctor herself. Their friendship, forged in the crucible of shared survival, remained strong across continents and cultures. Sometimes, on quiet nights in her apartment, Sarah would look out at the peaceful streets of her hometown and remember the sound of artillery fire in the distance. She would think about Ibrahim and Nadia in their mountain cabin, about Dr. Qasim and the other medical staff who had made it to safety, about all the people whose lives had been touched by the war in ways both tragic and heroic. The woman who had been abandoned behind enemy lines had indeed made it back on her own, but she had not made it back alone. She had been carried by the kindness of strangers, the loyalty of friendship, and the discovery of strength she never knew she possessed. These were the true treasures she brought back from her journey into darkness and back into the light.